according to the United Nations, Gaza has hit a breaking point. Desperate Palestinians have been forced to break into and loot a UN storage center in a, quote, worrying sign that civil order is starting to break down. Israel continues to expand its ground siege of Gaza, with armored vehicles pushing further into the region yesterday, according to the Associated Press. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu again rejected calls for a ceasefire, telling press during a news conference Monday, quote, calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, and that will not happen. Now, this week, the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed by Netanyahu calling for American support for Israel. He writes, this isn't only Israel's war. If Hamas and Iran win, you will be their next target, but we will prevail.
Per reporting in the New York Times around 2 weeks ago, quote, it became evident to U.S. officials that Israeli leaders believe mass civilian casualties were an acceptable price in the military campaign. In private conversations with American counterparts, Israeli officials referred to how the United States and other allied powers resorted to devastating bombings in Germany and Japan during World War II, including the dropping of the 2 atomic warheads in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to try to defeat those countries. What do you make of those comparisons, Jessica? Are they fair?
I don't think those are fair comparisons. I think it's really dangerous, especially what Netanyahu is doing right now, to make Americans afraid of Iran and Hamas in a way that has led to violence in the United States. There was a 6-year-old Muslim boy killed by his landlord. Now in the Houston area, just yesterday, it's been reported that a 42-year-old Muslim doctor was in a public park and was attacked and was killed. And so I think this is really dangerous rhetoric. Teaching people in the United States to be afraid of those who are Muslim is definitely something that Netanyahu has contributed to, and definitely the sentiments around the war between Israel-Palestine has contributed to. And it's really scary because the situation in Gaza right now is that regular people, women, children, families, again, the median age in Gaza is 18 years old. They don't have food, they don't have water, they don't have electricity, they've been under a blockade. And so they're so desperate that they have to go into a United Nations warehouse and get the food that's available because their very basic needs to survive are not being met. And I don't know if I'd call this, looting and say that, there's civil unrest within Gaza. It's really a war zone. They are under attack by Israel. They've been denied access to water, food, electricity, contact with the outside world. We've talked a lot about hostages in this conflict. There's been a lot of focus on the hostages taken by Hamas. What about the 1.1 million people living in Gaza? What is a hostage? It's someone whose movement is controlled. They're confined to an area. They have bombed the exits and only given announcements in English saying that there's a ground mission. They haven't given them a way out. They've taken away their ability to communicate with the outside world. They don't have electricity, food, and water. They control when they eat, who they can talk to. They've taken the entire population of Gaza hostage. And so really, the only way forward is to allow more humanitarian aid in, to have a ceasefire, and to begin negotiations. It's very clear that Netanyahu wants an escalation of this conflict to the extent that they want to eradicate Hamas. They keep talking about the use of civilians as human shields. So it sounds to me, because they believe it's just to bomb civilians now, they've already made that moral calculation. That means that they're not going to end until the entire population of Gaza is gone. This is a genocide that's underway. As 800 international law scholars have called it, it's really a devastating situation. And I think Netanyahu is making it worse by bringing the entire American population into his fear-mongering campaign.
I mean, they're trying to destroy Hamas. Hamas is the government of Gaza, and Hamas attacked Israel, and now it's responding to destroy Hamas. Hamas could end this by surrendering and releasing the hostages and cease being the legitimate or the quasi-legitimate government of the era. They're not actually a real legitimate government because they're a dictatorship that has not held, free elections since the aughts. As it is right to point out, the people of Gaza have not actually a majority of the population is born after that took place, had no chance to participate in choosing these people to be their leaders, and these people attacked, murdered, abducted, blew apart innocent civilians in Israel, and now are suffering the consequences that any state, any terrorist organization would suffer after doing a similar thing. However, I don't want to be drawn into World War III, which is what this rhetoric seems designed to accomplish, alluding to the destruction of Germany or the atomic bombings of Japan. I don't think those are, I don't think the U.S. has the appetite to be participating in a war that broad again over a quarrel in the Middle East between ethnic and religious groups that can't get along and haven't been able to get along for thousands of years. That doesn't seem like something that calls for for a World War II level rallying of American military resources, Americans' economic system. I mean, we reorganized all of society around winning World War II, or committing our ground troops, turning our factories into munitions factories, all that kind of thing. We don't want to do that. We don't want this conflict to get broader than it is. So I hope certainly that Biden's officials are pushing back when they're being presented with those examples. Well, look what you were willing to do to win your giant global conflicts in the past. Like, okay, but we're not willing to do that again. There is no appetite to do that. We've already given you more money than any other country for the last half century, and in fact, I would support, and maybe some Republicans, a minority of Republicans out there, support. Not denouncing Israel, but cutting them off and making them responsible for their own defense. So if they want to pursue this course of action, good luck to you, but that's on you. It's not going to reflect on the U.S., and it's not going to make us more vulnerable to attacks by terrorists or people in the extremists in the Muslim world who blame America for what's going on. We don't want that blame. We don't need that blame, and we should not deserve that blame by continuing to rubber stamp, give a blank check to every action taken in this region.
Yeah, I think Netanyahu, declining to have the hostages come home, the hostages that are with Hamas now, because of the refusal to have a ceasefire. The United States vetoed a ceasefire. Hamas has said time and again that if we have a ceasefire, we will release the hostages. I'm not sure why you would say give us the hostages without a ceasefire, because if you're continuing to carpet bomb Gaza, while hostages are being released from Gaza, you're putting those hostages' lives at risk. It doesn't make any sense, because a lot of what Israel is saying right now, what's coming out of the Netanyahu administration, doesn't make sense. For them to say that if we have a ceasefire, Hamas will just continue to fire rockets at us while we stop firing rockets at them, pretending they don't have a state-of-the-art defense system, the Iron Dome. When Hamas came into Israel that day, it was a huge breakdown of the Israeli defense system. They have one of the most sophisticated defense systems in the entire world. People living in Israel live very normal lives. So this assumption that Israel will be helpless in the case of a ceasefire, when the Palestinians, who don't even have a formal military, want a ceasefire because they don't have access to food, electricity, and water, they've essentially forced them into submission. They've offered to release the hostages. We need a ceasefire. 100+ nations have called for a ceasefire, but Israel has declined to have one. And all of the reasons they've given for why they've declined just don't make sense. It seems pretty clear to me that they just want an escalation of this conflict. Is this an ally that the United States wants to have? Because it seems to me it's a dangerous one. And as you pointed out, it sounds like Americans don't want their tax dollars going to a forever war. We can't keep giving Israel money to build an additional Iron Dome, to build an iron beam now with lasers. Is this what the American people want American dollars going towards? And if the answer is no, we live in a democracy, those dollars shouldn't go there. No matter how much Netanyahu tries to tell you Hamas is going to come to the United States and that Iran is going to retaliate against the United States, he's fear-mongering United States citizens to try and get them to support his war. And I think Americans at this point are a little bit smarter than that. And I don't think they can be propagandized as easily as they could be in a time when information didn't freely flow over the internet. It's a different age of conflict. And I think Netanyahu is using tactics that are a bit outdated against Americans. Look,
I am supportive of a ceasefire as long as the U.S. is involved in funding what's going on anyway. If we were not involved, then I think from Israel's standpoint, they're taking the position essentially that Hamas cannot remain in charge of Gaza. Hamas cannot continue to function as the government of the Gazan people, given that they have staged this brutal attack and their thinking is that there cannot be a peaceful resolution with this group until this group no longer exists, because they're just going to be attacked again at some point in the future. If there could theoretically be some negotiation for Gaza to be under different leadership, maybe the PLO, the group that governs the West Bank, that sort of thing. Okay, but it doesn't seem like there's enough political appetite for that on either the Israeli or the Palestinian side. So I think they're going to continue attacking Hamas until there is no more Hamas, and they're taking the position that the ceasefire delays what we need to do, which is to remove the terrorist group that attacked us. So I don't see Israel deciding to implement a ceasefire when the group that attacked them is still operating. I mean, right?
Yeah, I think that Palestinian people should have a right to determine what their government is and who their leaders are. So often, I think the United States goes and gets involved.
They haven't had that right, because they haven't been able to vote on who should be in charge of Gaza since the aughts, right?
They've been under an occupation by the Israeli government. It's been near impossible to live a normal life when you're under siege by another country. They can't even have.
I'm saying Hamas has not allowed for elections. I mean, you're saying they don't have any political power because the government does not allow them to vote for new leadership.
Holding an election in a war zone is near impossible. Another reason they haven't held elections is because Hillary Clinton in 2006 threatened U.S. intervention to have the kind of regime that the U.S. would favor in office in Palestine. It's been a really difficult situation for Palestinians to have any government at all, resisting not only the occupation from Israel, but essentially the promise from very powerful figures within the United States that they wanted to determine who their leaders are, likely pro-Israel leaders, given that Israel is the United States ally. Their land has been taken by Israel. Their people have been killed by Israel since 1948, since the Nakba. They've been displaced from their homes where their family lives. They haven't had the ability to have their own state or live on the land that is theirs. They've been pushed out. They've been killed when they've been trying to peacefully protest, at the tune of 31,000 people in 2018. A lot of folks are trying to justify the Israeli retaliation right now for Hamas killing 1,400 civilians this year, which was largely a response to the Israeli occupation and the Israeli brutalization of the citizens and people living in Gaza and the West Bank who are Palestinian, who don't have a military to protect themselves.
I'm not blaming the Palestinians. I'm saying that substantially the problem facing the Palestinians in Gaza is that they're run by a terrorist organization that has no interest in their well-being and has taken actions that is now leading to them getting killed, innocent people in the region getting killed by the thousands. And that's what the people running their society have done. And it's horrible and terrible. And that group needs to be gotten rid of.
The people of Palestine are busy fighting an occupation. It's very difficult to build themselves a state on land that's constantly being stolen, with borders that are controlled by Israel and Egypt. They don't even have an airport. They don't even have a way to get in or out. They're not allowed to have a military because they've been deemed as a nation to be run by a terrorist organization.
They've not been deemed it. They are run by a terrorist organization. They're run by an organization that just killed 1,700 people indiscriminately in their cars at the bus stations, abducted people from a music festival, set people on fire, tortured people, cut people's heads off.
The IDF has killed 31,000 civilians in a year. They've carpet bombed with 6,000 bombs, 4,000 tons of munition on Palestinians. The death toll is now surpassing 8,000 civilians killed. They've killed more children than in any other conflict in the entire world over the past 4 years. This is what Israel has done. And yet we are still calling Hamas a terrorist organization while not calling
We're calling them a terrorist organization because they are a terrorist organization. They just engaged in terrorism.
So was it terrorism when the Israeli government decided to kill 31,000 peaceful protesters who were protesting their land being stolen by Israel in 2018? Was that an act of terrorism?
I absolutely oppose the actions the Israeli government took to get us to this place. There's been a lot of solid reporting on actions Netanyahu has taken specifically that emboldened Hamas, but none of that gets around the fact that we're in this situation because a terrorist group attacked innocent civilians in another country. And that is an illegitimate action regardless of what had happened before it. You can't be mad or feel injustice and then start killing random people because of it. That's what Hamas did. And that's why they're an outlaw organization, and that's why they're being bombed until they don't exist anymore. And that's why innocent civilians are dying by the thousands in the region.
I think it's very fair to say that violence is terrible wherever it exists. And I think it's very fair that a lot of people are saying a lot of the violence that's happening in the region now is in retaliation to other violence. It's been a cycle. But we can't forget that the violence initially started with Israel pushing Palestinians out of their homes in 1948. They've been fighting back against an occupation, against Israel with a huge military that's been killing civilians to the tune of 10,000 plus in a year, 30,000 plus in a year. So when we talk about Hamas and we say that this is a terrorist organization that has killed 1,400 innocent people, yes, they have killed 1,400 innocent people. Violence is always bad, but we have to understand it in the context of the Israeli government committing acts of terrorism, killing 31,000 civilians in a single year because they're protesting, because they don't have the right to self-government. They don't have the right to borders to freely move through the land that they live on. They have their entire neighborhoods leveled. They have their, funerals met with Israeli forces beating the funeral procession when Israeli forces kill journalists that are trying to cover the conflict. The everyday state of people living in Gaza is living in a state of terror because Israel has removed their electricity, food, and water. That is terrorism. What's going on in the region? If we really care about peace, we need to recognize the actions of Israel as insane human rights violations, as many other countries around the world have done, and say that if we want a way forward, we can't have a government like the terrorist government that is led by Netanyahu. The current Israeli government is a terrorist organization. If you want to call Hamas a terrorist organization, the Israeli government is that times 10. And it's an ally of the United States. Why? It's time we all question that and we remove U.S. support of Israel. And we really support peace in the region, which means first liberation for the Palestinian people and a renegotiation of the land that's lived on and occupied by Israel, an end of that expansion. And we need new lines drawn. And I think the United Nations, with 100 plus folks voting for a ceasefire right now, would be in support of that. And the United States being the lone vote against that is what puts the United States at risk and the civilians living here at risk, not the United States, supporting a ceasefire, as Netanyahu would have us believe, that we would have retaliation from Hamas and Iran. What about the 100 nations that voted for a ceasefire that are looking at us as the lone vote that vetoed it in the Security Council? That's a much greater security risk.
Yeah, there's never going to be peace as long as there's a terrorist organization next door that starts randomly killing your citizens. It's like totally unrealistic. It's very naive. It's not going to happen. That's not to say the actions of the Israeli government are justified or good. I'm fine labeling every government on earth as a terrorist government. I find all government actions to be substantially illegitimate. But the reality is that no organization, no remotely cohesive social unit will not respond to an attack of this magnitude by trying to eliminate the threat on its borders. That's so obvious. Hamas has no interest in negotiating a long-term sustainable peace with Israel. That is the substantial problem here, that this area is governed by a terrorist dictatorship that has immiserated, impoverished the people under its purview. And that, look, we can all engage in wishful thinking. I wish that they turn over all the hostages, surrender, are taken into custody peacefully, that they just march out and submit themselves for surrender, and Israel ceases the bombing campaign immediately, and then the Palestinians are granted whatever solution is most amenable to both sides. A two-state solution sounds good to me, or equal political rights in a one-state scenario, get the West Bank in there too. That's fine, but that's never going to happen as long as the region is substantially governed by a terrorist organization. It's just never going to happen.
When I think about Netanyahu's government and whether or not it's a democracy, it's certainly not. I mean, he was facing huge opposition. People were taking to the streets in the masses because he proposed just changing the Constitution because he felt like it. He outraged the population of Israel, not only because there was a huge defense failure on the day of October 7th, but in the days leading up to that, there were huge protests, huge civil unrest, because he proposed to change the Constitution because he personally felt that the judicial branch in Israel had too much power, This is an autocratic regime as well. And if we call both of them terrorist organizations, which it sounds like you're welcome to do, the Hamas government and the Netanyahu government in Israel, let's look at the difference in the scale of the terrorism. You have
the U.S. Democratic Party anti-democratic for wanting to reduce the power of the Supreme Court? It's the exact same thing.
Israel carpet bombing Gaza, 6,000 bombs. There's no electricity allowed in. They're committing an act that is considered a war crime by international standards of collective punishment. They've held the entire population of Gaza hostage by not allowing them to have food and water, not allowing them to have hospitals after dropping 6,000 bombs on them. Then they took away their internet and ability to communicate with the outside world. This is a population of 1.1 million people. You want to talk about the 50 hostages that Hamas took versus the 1.1 million people living in Gaza right now being bombed by the Israeli government to the tune of 6,000 bombs, 4,000 tons of munitions within 6 days. That is insane. Their hospitals are not functioning. So if you are hit, if you are a casualty of these bombs, then you have nowhere to go. You can't go to the hospital. They don't have fuel or water. They are doing C-sections for pregnant women without any anesthesia. There are 5,500 pregnant women expected to give birth over the next month. Most of these people are children. They've killed more children than children have been lost in any conflict over the past 4 years. They killed 31,000 civilians in 1 year. And since October 7th, they've killed nearly 10,000 this year. It's over 8,000. And it's projected that that number is higher. Who's the worst terrorist organization? 50 hostages and 1,400 Israelis killed by Hamas versus what I just outlined by the IDF. I'd say the IDF is far worse as a terrorist organization.
Yeah, I think that's a monstrous view, but here we are having this discussion and debate on this heated subject. You decide. More rising right after this.